So, this is part two of the history of the Royal Academy's summer exhibitions. And as I move into the modern world, it becomes more difficult to create controversy as everything's in flux. There's no absolutes, no foundations. I'll come back to this work by Jenny Saville later, but let's begin where we left off at the end of part one in the middle of the Victorian period. This is James Abbott McNeill Whistler's Symphony in White No. 2, The Little White Girl, exhibited in 1865. An example of what was then a popular art movement and fashion style called the aesthetic movement, known for the phrase art for art's sake. Now, when I say popular, it became fashionable in the trendy middle classes, but Whistler wasn't admired by most of the art establishment, particularly the art critic John Ruskin. And that this disagreement culminated in the famous Whistler-Ruskin trial of 1878, when Ruskin had accused Whistler in his review of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. So Whistler sued him, and although he did win, he was only awarded a farthing damages and no costs, and the legal costs bankrupted him. And he left for Venice a year later on a commission. And when he returned from Venice, his engravings that he'd made in Venice restored his reputation. Even his enemies conceded he was the finest etcher since Rembrandt. Now, this painting is one of a series of three, and the musical idea associated with the word symphony in the title was suggested to him and applied retrospectively to all three. The word symphony emphasizes the idea that these paintings were intended to invoke a mood like music, tying in with the phrase art for art's sake. In other words, it doesn't represent a particular subject, a particular meaning. It is just itself. It represents what it is, beauty. However, we can't stop ourselves from thinking about possible interpretations. She looks wistful, sad. She's wearing a wedding ring. So we're inclined to start creating a narrative. But as I said, such works as this are not intended to tell a story, but rather invoke a mood. A very different sort of painting is this one by Elizabeth Butler. Now, women artists were exhibited, but they had many problems to overcome to establish themselves as leading serious artists. Now, Butler chose to concentrate, to focus on military subjects because she thought it was an area that wasn't well covered. And she did succeed in becoming one of the leading artists, but she was never elected as an academician, despite her fame. And unlike male artists, she had no wife to manage her affairs. She had to accompany her husband wherever he went on military duty. She had to manage his affairs and raise 6 children. This is the roll call, exhibited in 1874, and it's the work that made her famous. What we see is the remains of a battalion of Grenadier Guards, many exhausted, wounded, and what they're doing is answering a roll call after battle. And what she intended is this to represent an archetypical occasion of many similar occasions during the Crimean War, but it was generally assumed that it was the aftermath of the Battle of Inkerman. And it captured the imagination of the country when it was exhibited. It turned her into a national celebrity, and it was so popular that the police had to be stationed to hold back the crowds when it went on a tour of the country. She was popular with these military paintings. It was a time when there was a pride and nationalism for the growing British Empire. But she said, "I never painted for the glory of war, but to portray its pathos and heroism." Now, the public have been exposed to other images of the Crimean War, mostly prints, photographs, and newspaper illustrations, but never before had the plight of ordinary soldiers been portrayed with such realism. And I think that the public appreciated the honesty they found in her work. I mentioned the fashionable aesthetic movement. This is a painting by William Powell Frith, and he shows what was regarded as some of the shocking aspects of the new aesthetic fashion. And you can see, if you look around the room, this is a private view at the Royal Academy 1881, exhibited in 1883. And it contrasts the lasting historical achievements represented by, for example, the portrait of Disraeli, with what Frith regarded as ephemeral fads represented by, let's go through them, Oscar Wilde and the women on the left in green and orange dresses. Now, every person shown in this room was a well-known personality at the time. I won't go through them all, but let me pick out a few. There, behind Oscar Wilde, they're the actors, Henry Irving and Ellen Terry, with the writer Frederick Eaton, who was Secretary of the Royal Academy. There was the actress in white, Lily Langtry, with the Archbishop of York. There was Frederick Leighton Standing, President of the Royal Academy, looking down at Constance, Countess of Lonsdale. And sitting next to her, behind Leighton, is a self-portrait of William Powell Frith himself. Over on the left, the writers Anthony Trollope and George du Maurier. Over on the right, George Everett Millais, by then a pillar of the establishment, even though when he was young, he was one of the controversial pre-Raphaelite painters. Now, this is the group I was mentioned before, described by Frith as a family of pure aesthetes, absorbed in affected study of the pictures, with, he said, Trollope affording a striking contrast to the eccentric forms near him. Interesting, I think. Maybe the only odd thing is the woman is wearing a sunflower, but I think to us, the dresses they're wearing are no different from the other dresses in the room, but to the people there, they would be seen as very trendy, to some extent, odd, unusual in the way they were dressed. The painting is influenced, I think, by Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Patience, and the annoyance, in fact, many artists felt about the fashionable and trendy new art, this aesthetic movement. And it was made fun of by the operetta because it was regarded as an effete fashion with outrageous clothes and its love of all things Japanese. Now, I mentioned in part one William Etty, who had died, and after his death, the female nude was rarely exhibited at the summer exhibition, but it slowly started to make an appearance. And in 1870, Millais exhibited his first, and in fact his last, female nude. This painting is called The Knight Errant. It shows a knight who's just chased off two scoundrels which you can see running away right at the top right of the painting. And he's now cutting the bonds holding a woman who's been tied to a tree. Unlike the continental practice of idealizing the nude and placing it typically in a classical setting, Millet has painted an unclothed woman, and this caused consternation among the critics. The Art Journal, for example, claimed the manner is almost too real for the treatment of the nude. And the critics started to speculate on the woman's probable loose morals. Now, critics saw her, therefore, as an immoral, fallen woman, even though, of course, she wasn't responsible for her predicament. With the many poor reviews, coupled with the fact that he couldn't sell the painting, what he did was he cut out the head and chest of the canvas and repainted, sewed in a new piece of canvas and repainted that part to show the woman we see today turning away modestly. So how can we recreate what it originally looked like? Well, we know that the original section was later sewn into another canvas and exhibited in 1872 as the Martyr of Solway, now at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. Now, X-ray photographs of this painting show the original appearance, which I've superimposed here. And if I move it onto the original painting, we can see what it originally looked like and what the critics saw. She is turned towards the knight, establishing eye contact and therefore making the picture much less acceptable at the time. Now, following Millet's repainting in the form we see here, it was sold in 1874, and the critics did see her still as a fallen woman, but one worthy of compassion. Continuing this theme of the naked female form, this is Circe by John Collier, an artist who was influenced by the Pre-Raphaelites. And it was a controversial year at the summer exhibition because of the large number of female nudes that were exhibited that year. And I've selected one of them. Now, according to Greek mythology, Circe was able to turn humans into animals. But this painting received the following critique. It is as if one took a turn round the environs of an English country house and came on a member of the family sitting naked on the damp grass with a tiger by her side. The situation is improbable and chilly, and there is no look of Circe in the side face turned towards us. Why could he not call it Woman and Tiger instead of pretending to represent Circe, that wild conception of the old Greek mind? End of quote. So instead of following the tradition of the idealized nude, Collier has followed the French fashion of showing a fleshy naked woman that was too real for the British critics. And the criticism reached its peak with a letter published in the Times called A Woman's Plea and signed a British matron, although it was in fact written by a Mr. J.C. Horsley, a powerful artist and academician who held strong views against exhibiting any nudes. In fact, the previous year he wrote, at an exhibition purporting to be for general edification and entertainment, no picture should find place before which a modest woman may not stand, hanging on the arm of father, brother, or lover, without a burning sense of shame. And this was part of a broader campaign against what was called at the time deviant behaviour, and deviant behavior included homosexuality, incest, and prostitution. And this is the reaction to that letter in the Times, a cartoon caricature in Punch showing a woman, a matron, with the face of J.C. Horsley, disapproving of the Medici Venus, regarded as the greatest work of Greek sculpture at the time. There were as well a large number of female nudes painted by women artists. This is just showing you one example by Henrietta Ray, exhibited in 1885. Horsley, of course, complained that they were degrading their sex. Moving on to 1903, around about this time, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was a craze for these slightly risque, what were called problem pictures. And this is by John Collier. And his most popular problem picture, The Prodigal Daughter. And it draws on the theme of the fallen woman, but with a twist. The young woman is returning to her bourgeois home in fancy dress, exhibiting a notable lack of repentance. And this leads the viewer to question whether she is returning or leaving home, whether she's a repentant fallen woman or a modern new woman. And this is typical of problem pictures. What they do is they create a situation in which there are many interpretations, and the idea is that people, critics and viewers, would start to debate different interpretations of the picture and then pick out aspects of the picture that supported their interpretation of the picture, which made the pictures interesting, and they became a bit of a craze. It also, in a more subtle way, enabled people at the time to discuss and grapple with some of the changes that were taking place in society in the early 20th century, particularly the changing role of modern women. The press encouraged this sort of debate and even sponsored competitions for the best solution to these problem pictures, which they would then publish in the newspaper. Moving on, 1913. Now, in 1913, many of the artists exhibiting were women. Some people estimate about a third of the artists exhibiting were women, although when I looked through the catalogue, it seemed as though the number was far less than that, but there was still a significant number. Nevertheless, the suffragettes held an impromptu demonstration in the gallery calling for better recognition and rights for women in society. This is Laura Knight's self-portrait with nude. And again, I'm cheating a little bit because it wasn't actually exhibited in 1913. It was put forward, but was regarded by the committee as so controversial that they rejected it for the exhibition. And in fact, they did accept one painting by Laura Knight, this one that was exhibited, The Picnic, an uncontroversial painting. But just briefly returning to the rejected painting. Now, when Knight, and in fact any woman, was at art school, they weren't permitted to paint live models, and they were restricted to copying casts and drawings. Nevertheless, she painted this complex formal composition. She used mirrors so she could paint herself, painting the model and artist Ella Napper. And it was exhibited not at the Royal Academy but elsewhere. And the critics therefore saw it, and the Daily Telegraph critic called the painting vulgar and suggested it might quite appropriately have stayed in the artist's studio. And it remained controversial throughout her life, but is now seen as a masterpiece and a key work in the history of female emancipation. And years later, 1936, it was Laura Knight who became the first woman to become a full academician since the Royal Academy was founded with 2 women founders 168 years before. Slightly different sort of controversy here. On the 4th of May, which was the day the summer exhibition opened in 1914, the suffragette Mary Wood attacked this portrait of Henry James by John Singer Sargent, and this is the damage that she imposed on the picture with a meat cleaver. She took it from under her coat and slashed the canvas 3 times. It was the first attack that had happened in the Royal Academy, but the council was so worried they closed the winter exhibition early. It was actually the famous attack by Mary Richardson on Velasquez' Rockby Venus in the National Gallery in March in 1914, where she slashed the painting repeatedly with a meat cleaver that galvanized other suffragettes to follow. And there was a spate of attacks on works of art at the National Gallery, National Portrait Gallery, British Museum, and the Royal Academy. She wasn't actually supported by most of the women visitors. When she attacked the painting, women shouted, "Lynch her and turn her out." And one man actually aimed a blow at her, but she was protected by another man, who was then, the man who protected her was mobbed and his glasses smashed. And the Royal Academy installed guardrails to prevent further attacks. This is Oppie Wood by John Nash. Now, John Nash was the younger brother of the more famous Paul Nash. He wasn't trained as an artist, he was a newspaper reporter, but he was encouraged to paint by his brother Paul. And in fact, they had a successful joint exhibition in 1913. And it was John Nash fell in love with Dora Carrington and was an important influence on her work. He painted landscapes and still lifes, was a wood engraver and illustrator, and particularly interested in botanic works. He was trained as a botanist. And eventually, when he was 58, he became a Royal Academician. But returning to the First World War, when the war started, he was stuck in what he called the poor bloody infantry. He was frustrated throughout the war by his inability to gain a commission as a war artist like his brother. And he described how, as an infantryman, he became hardened to life in the trenches. And he remembered sitting eating bully beef surrounded by the remains of men blown apart by a shell that had landed in their trench earlier that day. And here we see a trench with a duckboard path leading to a dugout. 2 infantrymen stand to the left of the entrance. One of them is at a firing position known as a fire step and is looking over the parapet into no man's land. There's a wood of shattered trees littered with corrugated iron and planks. The sky stretches above in various shades of blue with spectacular cloud formations. Another scene from the First World War. This is called Gassed. It's by John Singer Sargent, and it shows the aftermath of this terrible gas attack. It was voted Picture of the Year by the Royal Academy. Not everyone liked it. E.M. Forster considered it to be too heroic. Winston Churchill praised its brilliant genius and painful significance, but Virginia Woolf attacked its patriotism. It shows the effects of mustard gas, and the effects only become apparent several hours later. It attacks the skin, eyes, and mucous membranes, causing large skin blisters, blindness, choking, and vomiting. And death can occur 2 days later, although the suffering can be prolonged several weeks. In this painting, Sargent is referring back to Bruegel's 1568 work, The Parable of the Blind, with the blind leading the blind. It also, Sargent alludes to Rodin's Burghers of Calais. What we see is a line of soldiers being led along a duckboard by a medical orderly. Their eyes are bandaged as a result of exposure to gas, and each man holds onto the shoulder of the man in front. One of the men is lifting his leg as if walking up a step. Another is veering out of line with his back to the viewer. There's another line of men, of blinded soldiers in the background, one leaning over to vomit onto the ground. More gas-affected men in the foreground, one of them drinking from a water bottle. And there's a crowd of wounded soldiers on the far side as well. And the tent ropes you can see of a dressing station on the right. And then right in the background, you can just make out a football match being played, lit by the evening sun. Now, Sargent received a £600 commission from the Ministry of Information to paint an epic work commemorating Anglo-American cooperation. Sargent was, of course, American, and he couldn't find a suitable subject, but had made a lot of sketches of lines of gas soldiers, and the committee agreed to change the subject of the commission, and he produced this painting, Gassed. In 1938, one of the most discussed works wasn't even displayed at the Royal Academy. It's another one that the Academy rejected. It's Wyndham Lewis's portrait of T.S. Eliot, and it created an outrage in the press because it was rejected. Lewis himself dismissed the Academy as a foul institution and claimed he had submitted it to test the committee. Augustus John resigned in protest and later wrote to Laura Knight, "It seemed pretty hopeless to oppose the predominant junta of deadly conservatism. If by my beastly action I shall have brought some fresh air into Burlington House, I shall feel justified." But by then the conservatism of the Academy was well entrenched and was supported, as we shall see, by Winston Churchill. But first I wanted to show you this painting by Churchill. Now, Churchill was an amateur artist, but he submitted this work so the committee wouldn't be biased, using a pseudonym, David Winter, in 1947. And both the paintings he submitted with that pseudonym were accepted by the committee, and in due course he was awarded the title Honorary Academician Extraordinary in 1948. He'd actually started painting during one of the lowest points of his life, following the failed invasion of Gallipoli in World War I. He was 40 years old then and First Lord of the Admiralty, and the Gallipoli campaign was his brainchild, but it resulted in a catastrophic loss of life and was seen to be a monumental failure. He was demoted, ultimately resigned his position, and became an infantry soldier and went to the front line in France. Later, he returned to politics, but the failed Gallipoli campaign haunted him for the rest of his career. Opponents and hecklers used to shout out Gallipoli to remind him of it. But this is the painting I referred to just now. By the late 1940s, there was open hostility between the national art institutions. There was a major clash between the modernisers and the Royal Academy. And there was a committee set up by the House of Commons which concluded that the National Art Gallery should be reorganised. The Tate was made independent of the National Gallery and received the Chantry bequest directly. And the works divided between the British art and modern art at the Tate. Now, Alfred Munnings, who painted this, was a horse painter and traditionalist, and he was elected president of the Royal Academy in 1944. He was incensed by the government report and tried to rally support for his cause, which was conservative and complete rejection of modern art. He wrote, for example, criticising the silly amateur visitors, as he described them, crowding into the Picasso exhibition at the V&A. And he felt the mood was swinging against him. He made a friend with Winston Churchill, and in fact it was Alfred Munnings who invented this title, Academician Extraordinary, which he conferred on Churchill. Now, on the evening of the 28th of April 1949, both Churchill and Munnings attended the banquet which was traditionally held before this summer exhibition, and their speeches were broadcast live. Now, Churchill made a speech first. He made some jokes about his paintings, which was fine. Then Munnings, by then a little drunk, rose and started to criticise modern art and all the academicians present, describing them as failing to produce great art, shilly-shallying, he said, and believing there is something in this so-called modern art. The speech was broadcast live to millions, and he went on to say he would rather have a damned bad failure than all this, what he called School of Paris. And he described the foolish men who supported modern art and named Anthony Blunt, Henry Moore, and Matisse. He then went on to quote Churchill, who was sitting next to him, as saying, "Alfred, if you met Picasso coming down the street, would you join me in kicking his something, something, something?" To which he replied, "Yes, sir, I would." Later, the BBC switchboard was jammed with complaints, not about his views on modern art, but because he used, as I said, the word damned. And this painting by Munnings was to be his last public criticism of modern art in 1956. It shows Sir John Rothenstein, director of the Tate Gallery, on the left, Miss Patricia Potter, who was an assistant buyer at Selfridges wearing a pink Selfridges dress, Humphrey Brooke, secretary of the Royal Academy, and professor from Oxford University, and they're all examining the sculpture intended to be a work by Barbara Hepworth, and there's parodies of work by Picasso on the wall. So Munnings is intending to make fun of modern art and those people that support it. Moving on, we now move into pop art. Peter Blake's self-portrait shows his equal respect, I think, for historical tradition and modern pop culture, and he no doubt based this image on Gainsborough's famous portrait, The Blue Boy, and now in California. But Blake's blue fabric is not silk, but denim, a material associated at the time with American youth culture, which Blake was fascinated with. He's wearing baseball boots, jeans and denim jacket, very trendy at the time, just coming into fashion. As were the badges. He's carrying a magazine dedicated to Elvis Presley, just becoming well known in Britain. And he's using these objects like a traditional portrait painter to suggest his interests or achievements. The American clothes he's wearing are bright, compared with the drab and indistinct British garden behind him, and he's brought together this explosion of consumerism in the US, of fashion and music in the UK, and of youth culture in both countries, which was completely changing the society at the time. One of the leading pop artists was David, and is David Hockney, although he actually rejected the term as too restrictive. Now, in 1985, he was made an Associate Royal Academician, and the following year he exhibited this work along with 2 other lithographs. Now, typically, a Royal Academician would charge £5,000 to £10,000 for a painting, and prints, lithographs, were seen as a low-cost way for visitors to acquire a work of a famous artist, and they would sell for sometimes as little as £40, perhaps £50, sometimes £100 each. And the big news of the 1986 summer exhibition was David Hockney's lithograph prints were on sale for £10,925 and £12,075 each. Multiplying by the print run, it would have given Hockney over £2.8 million for the print run. Now, Hockney claimed the prices were set by his assistant, and he deflected criticism by giving his local Bradford newspaper the right to include one of his prints in every copy of the newspaper they sold. And the paper was sold at 18p with a free Hockney print inside. And the following year, 1987, at the summer exhibition, he sold a bounce for Bradford, which was the Bradford Telegraph and Argus, the newspaper, with a web offset litho print of his in an edition of 110,000, which was sold in the Royal Academy shop for 18p each. So he broadened the offer the following year by selling 110,000 of his prints for 18p to deflect criticism. This is a painting by Ronald Kitty, and it was part of his what he called Sandra 3 installation, or the Sandra series. It consisted of the Sandra 3 consisted of 2 paintings, a collage, photos and quotes on 2 red and yellow panels. And what it was about is a long-running battle with certain British art critics who had tried to destroy his reputation in 1994, and in his view led to his wife Sandra's death from cerebral hemorrhage just a few weeks after the criticisms were printed. Now, what happened in 1994 was that the Tate ran a retrospective exhibition of his life's work, a great honour for any living artist. And certain critics who previously, before the exhibition, had been full of praise and looking forward to the exhibition, when it opened, described his work as fake, adolescent trash, puffed up, slushy, and unworthy of a footnote in the history of figurative art. And it seems that some of them, because the comments made appear to have been motivated by anti-Semitism. And as I said, a few weeks later, his wife died from cerebral hemorrhage. So Kitty began what he called the Sandra series, starting with Sandra 1 and Sandra 2, and then in 1997, Sandra 3, of which what I'm showing you here is the most significant part of Sandra 3. On the right, there's men with rifles firing at a multi-headed monster, the critics. The men have erect penises from which a yellow fluid enters the monster's mouth, out of which comes a long tongue made of rolled up newspaper on which is written something like yellow press, kill, 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 the heretic always kills heresy. The one-legged man on the right has a dripping pen in his holster like a gun. And Kittai explained the two men were himself and Edouard Manet, and at the bottom left are Penguin paperbacks concerned with murder, death and revenge. There's far more in the painting, but basically it's an all-out attack on the critics that he believed had killed his beloved wife. Now, the violence of the critics' response to this was even greater than in 1994, and within a month there were some 20 features criticising Kittai. The basic line of the critics was that all artists are criticised and he should turn the other cheek, he should accept criticism. But however, what they failed to address is that the original criticism was, it appears to me, to be an ill-considered emotional outburst against what they previously had admitted was a well-respected artist just a few weeks before. Some say, some sort of excuse the critics who were actually objecting to the labels Kittai had written for each work because they saw them as trite. And if that was the case, which it wasn't clear from their criticism was the case, then that's what they should have said. I think critics have a duty to explain why they don't like a work rather than just what I see as an emotional outburst. This is Gillian Waring, and it's self-portrait as my sister Jane Waring. And all of her work explores in different ways public and private identities of ordinary people and how they are seen and how they are self-fashioned and how we, in a sense, wear them. For this series called Album 2003, she reconstructed old family snapshots using silicone masks, which she fabricated with the help of experts at Madame Tussauds. And by putting a version of someone else's face on hers, she is metaphorically seizing their identity. And in addition, here she's wearing a dress her sister wore in the 1980s. And the only bits of Gillian Waring we can see are her eyes and her teeth. What she did working with Madame Tussauds is started with a mask in clay, working from the two-dimensional photographs she had, producing a three-dimensional image. And she explained that this whole process took some 4 months per mask, and how certain people tried to get her to use prosthetics, in other words, makeup, but she was adamant it had to be a mask. She wanted something that transformed her entirely, something that wasn't grotesque but real, like a trompe-l'oeil. Now, these expensive silicone masks that took 4 months to make very easily deteriorate, and in fact they could only really be used once. So it's a performative artwork, a performative act, and it turned into a photo shoot, and it's the photographs of her performance wearing the masks, because the performance itself is unrepeatable. The process becomes almost paradoxical because of the difficulties encountered in recreating these casual snapshots. She's exploring her own persona by capturing her relationship with her family members and their physical appearance, which she's putting on in order to illustrate the self-fashioning of our public and private identities. This is what she actually looks like, or did then. I said I would come back to Jenny Saville's painting Reverse. Now, it was exhibited in 2004, and the summer exhibition of 2004 was curated by David Hockney and Alan Jones. And they made the conservative but radical decision to focus on drawing as the theme of the exhibition. They wanted to draw everybody's attention to the marginalisation of drawing at art school. And they made the epigraph of the exhibition a statement by Ang: "Drawing is the truest test of art." However, what I've selected is a painting that stands out for me, and it's this painting by Jenny Saville called Reverse. Just to show you, it's a very large painting, like much of her work, and in fact it's a self-portrait. She said, "I'm not trying to teach, just to make people discuss, to look at how women have been made by men. What is beauty? Beauty is usually the male image of the female body. My women are beautiful in their individuality." There's a thing about beauty. Beauty is always associated with the male fantasy of what the female body is. I don't think there's anything wrong with beauty. It's just what women think is beautiful can be different. And there can be beauty in individualism. If there's a wart or a scar, this can be beautiful in a sense when you paint it. End quote. Now, this in some ways looks like a wound. And in fact, she was allowed to sit and watch a plastic surgeon at work in order to understand how the body works and what lies underneath the outer surface, to which we attach labels like beautiful or deformed. But that doesn't mean that she's intending to show us here an operation. She's creating an unromantic view of women, perhaps, to escape from the idea of what the male's perception of the way women should look like by painting women in unusual ways. She was elected a Royal Academician in 2007 and was then one of the youngest Royal Academicians ever elected. Tracey Emin was elected Academician in 2007. She was given a room to curate, and she chose to exhibit the work of her friends, Rachel Kneebone, Tim Noble, Sue Webster, but she also displayed her own work, and I'm showing here one of her works, Ruined, exhibited in 2007. Incidentally, the word tin, or the letters T-I-N, was originally meant to spell tiny, one of her favourite words and the name she gave to her unborn child. Now, her work by this time was no longer creating controversy. 10 years previously, the Sensations exhibition at the Royal Academy was controversial, but the art world and the viewers were taught or learnt to expect anything. The artists who were exhibited at Sensations were known as the YBA, the Young British Artists, and included works then by Damien Hirst, the shark suspended in formaldehyde called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, Tracey Emin's Tent, entitled Everyone I Have Ever Slept With, 1963 to 1995, Mark Quinn's self-portrait bust made from pints of his own blood, and Sarah Lucas's explicitly sexual images and sculptures. but perhaps the most controversial work was Marcus Harvey's portrait of the child killer Myra Hindley, and Chrysophiles, the Holy Virgin Mary, that included elephant dung and pornographic images, caused particular controversy when it was exhibited in New York. This I find is a, a more amusing work exhibited at the... Now, let me just explain a bit of the background. At the summer exhibition, the works are on sale, and the Royal Academy takes 30% commission. And to indicate a work has been sold, the Academy puts a red dot on the work, and if it's a print, there can be many red dots, one for each sale. And in this case, what Cornelia Parker has done is she's reproduced a very popular print, but erased the print, leaving a blank image. And she's put lots and lots of red dots around it. So it's an amusing work. But before I move on, I wanted to show you this work, perhaps one of her best known works. It's a garden shed that was blown apart by Cornelia Parker at the Banbury Armoury School of Ammunition. She then, with some volunteers, picked up all the pieces and meticulously suspended them as if in mid-flight. She was, in a sense, exploring cartoon death of the sort you see in cartoons, falling off cliffs, things being run over by steamrollers and flattened and then getting up again, things being blown up, shot full of bullets, like Roadrunner or Tom and Jerry. She said, "The garden shed came about because I was trying to find something universal and archetypical, and that we all identified with and was familiar to us. It's not the house, but this kind of attic-y private place at the bottom of the garden where we put all of our leftover stuff. And so it seemed like a depository rather than the place you lived. The point of suspending it is to rob it of its pathos. After it was blown up, all the objects were lying on the floor, all very distressed. They had a pathos, and somehow putting it back in the air where they were a little before sort of reanimates them." End quote. The 2018 summer exhibition was special as it was the 250th anniversary of the summer exhibition, and Grayson Perry, shown here, was asked to curate the exhibition. And he painted the walls of the biggest room bright yellow and packed them with pictures. Now, one of the great strengths of the summer exhibition has always been from the beginning that anyone can be selected and hang alongside the great and the good. And to make the point, Perry has created this great jumble of work from all social classes. He intentionally selected work that in previous years would have been rejected to demonstrate the diversity of art in Britain today. There's actually a professional artist, Olga Lomeka, whose elongated fiberglass sculpture of the Pink Panther is behind him, strung sideways through an abstract blue canvas. And to the left is a serious portrait of Nigel Farage by David Griffiths. There's a sort of tongue-in-cheek amusement created by this wild assortment of art, which undermines and liberates any definition of what art is today. And this was intentionally done by Grayson Perry. Art is whatever you want. It is good, bad, conservative, and shocking, and reflects the diversity of expression and culture in today's Britain. I thought I'd end in 2018 after 250 years of British art. I hope you enjoyed this quick overview of the history of British art as told by the few controversial works that I selected from exhibitions over the 250-year period. Goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon.